So this isn't the purpose of this channel. This channel was initially meant to be a language practice zone for me, but my being super camera shy and super busy has so far stopped that from happening. But there are some things that will spur even the super busy into action, and apparently this is my breaking point. Someone I'm not very close to once mentioned in a group chat that they'd love to live in Japan. I unthinkingly laughed a little and said I doubted it because I know aspects of that culture that stand in opposition to Western sensibilities. Their immediate response was to get angry and explain how they liked the depth of history in Asian countries and how respectful we were of our elders and things like that. I'm not even Japanese, and I had to immediately withdraw from that conversation just to feel safe. You might perceive this as an overreaction, but the thing is that the mentality she displayed right there, the mentality that causes a white person to dress up in a kimono at the AMAs, or people to tell me that your English is so good, is exactly what leads to things like the shooting in Georgia. People are talking about whether the shootings in Georgia constitute a hate crime, but in my opinion, that takes the focus off the fact that the shootings happened because of things people don't consider hate. The shooter said that the women he shot were temptations he had to remove. Those words are Asian fetish manifesting as outright violence, but the problems with Asian fetish go so much farther than outright violence. At the start of the pandemic, I made a joke with my friends about not coming to school because I had a small cold and I didn't want anyone to shank me for being an Asian person who sneezed. My friends got angry. And I found myself genuinely surprised that these two people who loved me would get angry at the idea of someone causing me bodily harm because of the way I looked. People think that because I'm ethnically Asian, I'm part of the model minority, that I walk around free from the ever-present fear that someone might rape, hurt, or humiliate me on the basis of race. But I do walk around with that fear. That fear is so familiar to me that it barely registers as something my friends should get angry about. And it's not like it comes from nowhere. It comes from having someone come up to me on the street while I'm just minding my own business and informing me, as if it's something I should know about my culture, that so many Asian boys are gay because their fathers beat them. Please, don't make me explain why this is both false and offensive. It comes from having a boy yell, "How do you like this country?" across the street from me. It comes from white people ni-haoing me when I have no Chinese blood in me. Let me make this abundantly clear. Asian fetish is not cultural appreciation. You know how you'll sometimes hear about people living in foreign countries assuming America is synonymous with hamburgers, obesity, and guns? It's like if people constantly said that sort of thing to you, as offensively as possible, except in your native country and your native language, and then acted as if you should be grateful for it. Real cultural appreciation is getting to know people from those other cultures, finding real value in cultural norms that you have taken the time to understand, and appreciating their art and music and media, not because it's different from your own, but because it says something profound to you about humanity as a whole. A white friend of mine asked me recently how I felt about people outrage knee-jerking Stop Asian Hate on their IG stories as if they really cared this whole time. His words, not mine. And I told him that at the very least, it's putting Asian American issues into the forefront for once, because giving a shit about how Asian people feel is a totally new thing for this country. What I told him, and what I will tell you all now, is that racism against Asian people is a thing people in this country have such hardcore denial about that a week ago, no side would have even classified it as a major issue. A year ago, the term Asian hate was unheard of, but boy, has the concept existed for as long as there have been ethnically Asian people in this country. And that got us, me and my white friend, to talking about some good old history. To be clear, Asking an Asian person to educate you is not the right move for most people. It worked with me because this friend of mine knows I love talking about Asian history and used it as an opportunity to support my mental state rather than primarily to educate himself. Disclaimer, I am not a historian, and some of what I am going to talk about are things that I have learned about history, experienced myself, or extrapolated from those two things. Being ethnically Korean, I took all this from a largely Korean perspective. Now, the way American people interact with ethnically Asian people is absolutely hilarious because they somehow manage to assume we're all one people and also interact with different cultures in starkly different ways. Even if you just focus on the 3 classic East Asian countries, which totally erases the unique experiences of other Asian people, like people from the Philippines or Vietnam, you get this weird mixing of understandings that are all treated very differently. So what do I mean by this? What I've generally observed, and someone who is ethnically Chinese or Japanese can reach out and correct me as they might have had different experiences personally, is that Chinese people are what Westerners classically think of when they say Asian American, because they're the most common type of Asian American. This includes seeing them as the smart model minority. At the same time, the Chinese, being from America's longtime enemy, are also looked down upon and disliked as barbarians with no respect for art or culture. It sits Chinese Americans in this weird place where lots of people either think of them as math nerds or barbarous swindlers, and there isn't really an in-between. The Japanese sit in a completely different place. The short answer for why is basically because after America dropped the world's worst bomb on the Japanese, they did a facelift on their culture to make themselves cutesy and non-threatening so it wouldn't happen again. And in doing so, they kept parts of themselves that Westerners really like in concept, such as respect for elders and some level of social politeness and reservedness, along with their food and pretty mountains and flowers and whatever. But so when Westerners think of Japanese people, what I'll primarily hear is something about 1, kimonos, 2, sushi, and 3, anime. And I don't know how these are all elegant and pretty or whatever. This totally involves fetishization because it's all about the aesthetic of Japanese culture as opposed to the reality of living in it. That's why weebs are a thing. The term has just been used for whoever likes anime nowadays, which I like anime just fine. But it originated as people who liked, or it originated as a term for people who liked Japanese culture, particularly anime, so much that they wanted to be Japanese while again not really understanding it. That said, the fetishization focuses not so much on Japanese women or people, but on Japanese culture as a whole. I would bet that ethnically Japanese women, even though several generations removed from Japan, have had to deal with extremely creepy fetishization that has to do with how Americans interact with sexual works from Japan. So I am not saying that Japanese people do not have to deal with the negative impacts of fetishization. The only reason I prefaced it this way is because I wanted to explain why I see it as different from how Americans fetishize Koreans, which is something I know a little bit more about the historical context of. So, all of this for how Americans fetishize Koreans comes back to World War II and the Korean War. For those of you who don't know, Japan occupied Korea for a while, which extended into World War II. Once the Japanese surrendered, however, during World War II, at the end of World War II, the US and the Soviet Union decided that they would just, continue the occupation, except split Korea between them down a random line they drew on a map, because not like the Korean people, hated being occupied to the point where they fought Japanization for over 40 years or anything, but they were grateful to the Soviets and the US for ending Japanese colonization. And the Soviets and the US were less obviously anti-Asian, so they resisted the state of occupation less. Long story short, North Korea began to nominally support the Soviet model for perfect government, and South Korea began to nominally support the US model for perfect government, or what we in the States would call communism versus democracy. But the Korean people considered themselves a unified Korean people, and neither the North nor the South were willing to just cede and become separate countries without a fight. So a war started over which government would become the one true government of a unified Korea. The thing is, at the same time, as you might expect from what I said, a little something called the Cold War was happening. So instead of just letting the Koreans duke it out, the Soviets and the Chinese supported North Korea and the Americans supported South Korea. And I don't just mean by sending them nice letters or anything. I mean full-on supplying them with troops and weaponry. We call it the Cold War because America and the Soviets didn't go to actual war. The hilarious thing is that the Korean War, which was one of several direct playouts of the Cold War just on somebody else's soil and involved the direct participation of US soldiers, led to the deaths of an estimated 3 million people. But I digress. At the end of all this fighting, everyone realized nobody was getting anywhere, and the two countries stayed separated. The reason why I say this is important in fetishization of Koreans is because this means two things. It means that American soldiers got stationed directly in South Korea for a period of time, and it means that South Koreans worshipped Americans as their saviors. And I know that that sounds somewhat degrading, but I say that because I know how even my grandparents will talk about one of the American generals whose name I don't even remember, as if like he was some great leader when he was really just an American soldier on Korean soil fighting communists or something. But anyways, during World War II, the Japanese set up a system of comfort women to provide sexual services for their soldiers by forcing women from occupied areas into prostitution. This was in no way limited to Korea, but it certainly happened in Korea and involved plenty of Korean women. So when American soldiers were stuck in Korea for a while, what do you think happened? The system of comfort women was employed this time by the Korean government to service American soldiers. And American soldiers, not entirely understanding that this isn't the normal state of affairs and comfort women was a thing for them, brought back this understanding that Korean women sort of equated to sex. Not to disparage American soldiers in general. But this is what happens when a culture is not really understood and yet becomes associated with things like physical pleasure, which you would perceive as being a good thing, but of course doesn't manifest that way. Again, dangers of fetishization. Anyways, the Korean War didn't happen that long ago. People act like the Cold War was ancient history or something, but my grandfather still knows some Japanese because he was old enough to be educated during Japanese occupation. My grandmother tells me stories about how she had to carry her siblings on her back farther down south one of the several times North Korea took Seoul during the war. The history of Korean comfort women isn't so far in the past that it doesn't have an impact on how Koreans are seen today. It is one of the things that feeds into the social consciousness of Asian women as submissive and sexual. And I mean the social consciousness as in the social consciousness of America specifically. So Korea being at the time dirt poor and war-torn, marrying a Korean girl became kind of a sexual transaction thing. A number of Korean girls were understandably desperate to get out of there, and marrying particularly a white man was a rare opportunity to do so, allowing those men to feel powerful while also attaining girls, oftentimes much younger than them, for at least partially sexual motivations. So, another instance of that mail order bride culture striking. As for what happened after the Korean War in Korea, South Koreans venerated the Americans as their saviors during the war, but also began to experience an unprecedented boom in economy that was in part helped along by Westernization. In a very short span of time, South Korea went from an extremely poor country trying to pull itself out of war-caused poverty to one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And I mean short as in my dad left a relatively poor soul in his teens and came back about 10 years later to a nearly unrecognizable city. This is not a span of even a generation. So you can see how white culture in general was seen as somehow better. And this all tied into the aesthetic of the Korean people. Naturally, Koreans can be quite dark-skinned with sharp eyes and flatter round faces and features. I know I don't look super dark-skinned because as a grad student, I don't see the light of day. But as a child, I went swimming a lot during the summer in California, and lo and behold, I tanned really easily. I was pretty dark when I was a teenager. But if you ask anybody what Koreans look like, the first thing they'll think of is a fairly pale people with sharp features, high cheekbones, angled, skinny faces, with maybe a remnant of sharp eyes or round noses. That's not natural for most Koreans, but it's the aesthetic Koreans currently push because of what I would call a sort of white worship, me being an American person, not a Korean person, nationally. And some people just happen to look like that because people look different. But it was also easy and possible to obtain that look because Koreans got really big on plastic surgery. And it just so happens that this oddly white aesthetic is highly tied to the aspects of Korean culture that got transported to America as they modernized. By which I mean, instead of animation, Koreans are famous for their dramas, their pop stars, and their beauty products, all of which involve the beauty of the Korean people, who have modified their general aesthetic to be more white, but somehow still preserving enough of their original differences so that they also still seem exotic. And this is all exacerbated by the feminization of Koreans in the eye of the Western world. You don't find a lot of Korean male stars known for being buff. Look up any popular Korean girl group and you will find one or two songs that sounds freakishly cutesy, even babyish, which in combination makes Westerners feel more powerful and masculine than the Korean people and reinforces the idea that Korean women wouldn't want someone weak like a Korean man. This is also hilarious because traditional Korean culture, the old culture that my dad brought with him before Korea industrialized the way it did, ironically aligns particularly well with masculine Western culture. People snipe each other as a way of showing affection. Men are supposed to be emotionally stoic and strong, and even the women, particularly the older women, can often be like the real power in the household. I have met exceptionally few Korean people who do not share some level of extreme stubbornness and rough affection. Not that this is inherently a good thing, it's just incredibly funny to me that Koreans and Asian people in general are more associated with femininity than masculinity, when that's basically the opposite of how I observed Korean people interacting as I grew up in largely Asian spaces. So that's kind of my overly long rant on how Korean history led to one aspect of extra Asian fetishization of the Korean people by Americans. But I want to reiterate what I said in the beginning. The fetishization of Asian people is what leads to things like the shootings in Georgia. This is true of the fetishization of Japanese culture as well. I have had people tell me that they love Asian women. I am not kidding. Or sushi or Korean barbecue, which again, I'm not Japanese. So anyways, I have had people try to speak to me in Chinese as if they're being considerate of me and trying to speak my language, when not only am I not Chinese, English is my first language, so of course I speak it fluently. The reason why I say all of this attitude leads to someone specifically targeting Asian massage parlors and shooting 6 Asian women is because in order to do something like that, you need to see people like me as lesser, just because of the way I look and the language my grandparents speak fluently. Acting like the culture I came from is exotic without taking the time to see it for what it is feeds into the mentality that Asian women are sex objects instead of real human beings. Before this act of blatant violence, people acted like racism against Asian people didn't happen, or like it was kind of harmless, you know? We don't treat the model minority badly because they stay in line. The truth is, I walk around afraid because I know incidence of sex crimes is high against Asian women. I have to put up with people spouting stupid bullshit about my father being abusive when he is one of the funniest, most quietly caring people in my life. I get treated like my interest in science, my skill with math, things that I've worked hard for, are just given to me by God, while people also act like it's strange that I can be well-spoken and articulate in my native language, which is English. I am used to my pain being overlooked and my voice delegitimized because I am not white enough to be a real American person and not Asian enough to be a real Korean person. I know what it's like to have big feelings and strong opinions and loud thoughts that I just have to hold because it is actually dangerous to express myself. Publishing this video is a scary experience for me because on the off chance people actually watch it, having my face out there and talking about this issue that directly impacts me means opening myself up to the possibility of people stalking me or sending me death threats or racial slurs or offensive come-ons. Can I call it terrorism yet? Even my background, I chose a spot in this room that was as unidentifiable as possible just because I know there are some internet trolls out there. So, check out Xiran Jay Zhao's video if you want to know more about ways in which you can tangibly help the Asian American community, which I'll link below. But for this kind of thing to stop, shootings and high incidents of rape against Asian women and things like that, it's not just about stopping Asian hate, which is why it's so interesting to me that that's what people latched onto, is stop Asian hate. Because a lot of what people think of as hate is not the same thing as the racism that's done against Asian people. If we really want this to stop, it's about stopping Asian fetishization, dehumanization, exotification. Those things may not sound like hate to you, but they sure play out like it. I might look a little different from you, have grown up with slightly different food, but I'm still a person who knows what it's like to struggle, to celebrate my life, to love my friends and family, and to want to share things unique to my childhood experiences. I'm not a magical elf from a fantasy story, so stop acting as if it's okay to assume things about me, even things you consider complimentary, when you haven't put in the work to get to know me or the culture I come from. That's all I have to say. So, signing off.